Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai. Thank you to the Circle of Friends for sponsoring this last minute presentation. In other words, we only planned this very recently. And there's a story behind that. Greg and I go way back to like 1972, but I have not seen Greg for 45 years until recently. And I wondered where he'd been all this time. And we reconnected in Berkeley recently. And Greg came to an event that I was at, and I was startled to see him after 45 years or so. And I felt very, that we had to talk. So we went out to dinner together, and he told me that he had been in India in 1969 for 4 months with the Mandali at a time when very, very few people went. That was right after Darshan, in other words. So when I heard that, I thought, well, have you told your stories? And believe it or not, at that time that we first spoke at the restaurant, he had not publicly told his story of 4 months with the Mandali in late '69. So he told me a few stories, and I realized, wow, it's like these things have been in a time capsule, buried in the ground for 50 years. And so now it wasn't really my idea to go on the road and do a road show, which his wife Joan accused us of going on a road show just by. But he had never been to Myrtle Beach. This is his first time in 50, since he's been a Bible lover since the late 60s. So I thought, okay, we'll kill as many birds with one stone as we can. We'll go to the center, we'll go to Asheville, we'll visit the archive in Asheville, we'll visit the Circle of Friends, we'll give as many talks as we can. So this is whatever we're doing right now, it's a work in progress. And I need to apologize because the slide portion of this, even though my son prepared all the slides, I couldn't download them because when we flew into Asheville, I promptly got into a car accident. My whole electrical system of my car went bad till today. So I had no time to, so what we're going to do is a second part. Part 2 will be the visual part. And today we'll mainly focus on Greg's stories because they're, like I said, they've been in a time capsule for 50 years. Both of us have been Bible lovers for 52 years. That's a long time. And I was thinking about this last night on the center, and I thought, is that even possible? 52 years? But here we are. So we're going to do a little bit of a tag team here and there, but mainly I'm introducing Greg Harland, who, well, I'll let Greg introduce himself because he knows his own biography better than I do. But suffice it to say, he's married to Joan Harland, who's Lud Dimfle's daughter. Okay, and so Greg has had Baba around him all these years, but he in a way he's been in suspended animation, like Rip Van Winkle.
Hibernation.
Hibernation, okay. So with that, I'll let Greg.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. Jai Baba, everybody.
Jai Baba.
This is the second time I've given this talk in 50 years. In fact, 50 years ago today, I was in Mehrabad, staying with Padre and Mansari and Sidhu and Muhammad. And so, but I want to go back and start back in 1968 in Berkeley, just to give you a feeling of the atmosphere back then. Baba's still in the body, and we're just, the energy is very, very high, and we're just very excited. I mean, just every day is just filled with Baba. And lots of people are coming to Baba because we're talking to people just spontaneously all the time, telling them about Baba, and people are receiving it spontaneously. You know, you talk to someone, just a stranger on the street, and then see them later that night at a meeting. So Baba's energy was very, very, very high. Baba was still in seclusion at that time and wasn't allowing anybody to come to India. In fact, I had attempted to go to Pakistan. People accused me that I was going to India, but I was really going to Pakistan, and that didn't work out, but that's another story. But anyway, there's lots of little incidents. I'll give you one. One night I was walking around the campus. I used to go at night and walk around the campus for exercise, and a very vigorous walk. And when I was done, I came back to the student union and went inside and sat down on a bench. And I looked up, and there was all the display cases were filled with pictures of Baba. And I walked right by them without noticing, really. And then I looked up, and I saw this picture of Baba, and then this cross kind of appeared across his face, which was a shadow. But it almost seemed like it fell on there as I looked up. And then the man next to me jumped up, screamed, and ran out of the student union. And so I got up a few minutes later, and I went out of the student union, and I'm walking down Telegraph Avenue, because I lived just beyond Dwight Way on Telegraph Avenue. And as I got down close to, there was a Cafe Mediterranean, and next door was an ice cream shop. And I saw a crowd of people standing around the outside of the ice cream shop. And so as I got to the crowd, I looked in, and it was the same man who had jumped up next to me and ran out. He was inside the ice cream shop, and they had lattice on the wall, and he was like pulling the lattice down, trying to climb the wall. And everybody was shocked. So I pushed my way through the crowd and grabbed him by the arm and pulled him out, and then took him over to my apartment and calmed him down. And I kept saying, "Don't worry, I know what's going on, I understand." And when we got in the apartment, he said, "That man came down out of the picture at me, and it scared him." And I told him, "That's Mayor Baba, and he's my master." And I went and got him a book. I think The Everything and the Nothing. And when I handed him the book, he looked right at me. And not long after that, he just disappeared. He left. Turned out that that person is a very notorious person today. I'm not going to say who it was, but it was someone that eventually made national news. But it was just interesting that he had this interaction with Baba. But
Yeah.
I thought you said it should.
Can we
Well,
guess?
we all want to know.
Yeah, we all want to know.
Well, it's funny because I have this kind of real powerful memory, visual memory. You know, like I can watch movies, and if something happens in the next scene and it doesn't agree with, something's out of place in the last scene, I pick it up right away. Anyway, so when he looked at me, I just registered his face. And I actually went back to see if he had been in Berkeley at the time, and he had been in Berkeley at the time. This was the Unabomber.
Holy shit. Ted Kaczynski or whatever his name was.
Yeah, it's interesting about connections because my wife actually worked for one of the men that he mailed a bomb to, and it blew his hand off. Yeah. So, anyway, there was lots of stuff happening then. Like I said, the energy was very, very high. And then Baba announced that he was going to give darshan. And obviously this was a very exciting thing because we didn't know it was coming, and all of a sudden he said, okay, it's going to happen. And so I immediately went out and got 3 jobs because I wanted to earn the money as quickly as possible. I was going down in the morning and working, loading 100-pound sugar sacks into boxcars. And it was a wonderful job because there was about 8 of us doing this, and the other 8 men were all like 6'4" to 6'7", 6'8". They were all black, and they were just so wonderful. You know, loading these sugar sacks was very, very hard. And sometimes I'd have to turn around and throw up, you know. And sometimes they would just tell me to lay down and rest. You know, they'd cover for me. And during the lunch hour, they would sing hymns and stuff. So I'd finish from there, and then I'd go up to the Claremont Hotel, and I'd work in the kitchen up there, and then I'd finish from there, and I'd go down to a restaurant called Cruchon's, and I'd work at the restaurant. So every day was like, but after a couple of weeks, I felt great. I was just getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And one day when I was coming from the Claremont Hotel to go to Cruchon's, I can remember exactly where I was. I got this voice in my mind, in my head, saying, "You're not going to darshan." But you'll go in your own time, in your own way, and it'll be very special to you. So I started telling my friends, you know, I don't think I'm going to darshan, and some of them got very upset at that idea. I said, I just know I'm not going to go. And later on, then Baba dropped the body. And when Baba dropped the body, we had 3 planes chartered, and some people just decided they weren't going to go anymore. So one plane was canceled. And even though I think I was the first one in with my money to the Sufi Center, since the Sufis had chartered the plane, they felt they had the right to the first seat. So mine was moved to the 3rd plane, and they canceled my ticket. But I was fine, because I knew all along I wasn't going. I was really comfortable. And another Baba lovers got really angry with me and said, you know, you should do anything you can to go to darshan. You should go over and fight with the Sufis. If you can't win that fight, you should go to New York, which Clive did. And if you don't, you're not a Baba lover. When Baba told me that I would go in my own time and my own way, and it would be special to me, it just completely relaxed me. In fact, I would say I went into hibernation at that point. And I didn't even think about it. I drove all my friends, and in fact, that one friend that had yelled at me, all to the airport, and took all their luggage and stuff. And when they came back, I picked them up. And I said to that person, I said, "Did you see Erich?" Because I was really fascinated with Erich. And he said, "Yeah, but he was in a crowd and I was in the back and I didn't really hear him, you know." I said, "Oh, okay." So anyway, life seemed to just carry on as normal. And then one day, many months later, I woke up and it was like every cell in my body was pointed towards India. And I knew that I had to go now. And I didn't have a passport or anything, so I went to the passport office in San Francisco. And usually those things, I tried to hurry it up by bringing my pictures in and stuff. And the man at the window said, "Would you like it today?" And I said, so he said, "Go sit on the bench over there, and I'll be out in about 25 minutes. And he came out 25 minutes with a passport. And then I went to get my shots, and the shots usually took about a week because you had to space them. You had typhoid, typhus, all kinds of stuff. And the nurse said, "Would you like them all today?" And then I went down to this travel agent, and she said, "Oh, I just happen to have this ticket right here. Do you want it?" And it was a very special ticket. And I said, "Okay." So I was leaving almost immediately. When I got to India, it was very, back then it was very, traveling was a little more difficult and stuff. And I remember taking the train, and you just kind of just had to find your way around. And I remember there was a train that connected from Pune to Ahmednagar, and this train would wait for from the Bombay train. This train would wait for the Bombay train to arrive, and then take the passengers and take them on to Pune. And I remember as we arrived, we could see the other train disappearing into the, They just decided they didn't want to wait. That's not uncommon in India. And so the man took me into this little area, a sitting area, and asked me if I wanted anything to eat. And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he brought me this bowl of bright red something. And I took a bite, put it in my mouth, and all the lights went out. And my head was exploding with fire. So then eventually I got on another train, went in, and I remember someone on the train telling me as we went past the tomb that Baba's tomb was up there. So we got to Ahmednagar. It was late at night, and back then they only had what's called a tonga. It's a little wagon that's pulled by a horse, and you'd sit in the back and the driver would sit in the front. And so there was this tonga there, and I said, "Can you take me to a hotel?" And he said, "Sure." And he took me to this hotel, and in the hotel they took me upstairs, and I kind of wasn't aware of what was going on. Turned out, I woke up in the morning to this huge cacophony of sound. There was a wedding going on outside, and the room that they had me in was actually just a plywood box built on top of the roof. And so there was no soundproof. I mean, this wedding had everything, including an elephant. From there I went over got my way to the trust office, and when I went to the trust office, Adi came out and he was, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And I said, told him who I was. He said, "Well, you didn't tell us you were coming. Why, you're supposed to tell us you're coming. You're supposed to send." And I said, "Adi, I did all that. I sent you a picture and I sent you a letter and all that." He said, "No, you didn't." And I said, "Yes, I did." And so Adi piled me into a car and drove me to the other side of Ahmednagar. Normally, you would stay across the street at a little place called the Dowlat, a very sweet little place, but Adi was not happy with me. So he dumped me into this hotel that was really a very Indian experience. When they took me up to the room, the walls in the room were covered with pond spittle. Pond is something that they chew and spit out or swallow, one of the two. But all the walls had this pond spittle all over it. And so I said, So I went back down, and I went down Mahatma Gandhi Road, and I found what I thought was like a hardware store, and I bought a big metal bucket and a box of powdered soap and a big brush. And I went back to the hotel, and I went up and I pulled the beds out into the hall, and I just started scrubbing. And there was a window there, but it didn't have glass in it. It just had iron bars in kind of a window pane fashion. And the window was just full of faces, just watching me scrub this room down. And so after I was done scrubbing the room down, I decided to go out and walk around and, get oriented where I was. And after an hour and a half or two or something, I came back and the manager of the hotel was standing out in front in a little white jacket. It was like one button off too. And he was he was so happy that I'd come back. He insisted that he give me a tour of the hotel. And so when we went in, there was people all over the hotel with brushes and buckets, scrubbing it in. So the next morning, I noticed from the balcony that there was a big well out in front of the hotel. And there were these kind of rocks on the edge there, and there were women there washing clothes. So I decided, well, I got to wash some clothes, So I got my bucket and got my clothes and went down and got, the women showed me how to get the water out of the well. And the way you do it is you dunk the clothes in the water, and then you kind of wrap them up and you swing them over your head and you pound it against the rocks, and you're basically just beating the dirt out of the fabric. And as I'm doing this crowd starts to gather. And I don't know how, it could have been like 400 people in this crowd just gathered around this well. And so one man steps out and he asked me first, they always ask you, where are you coming from? And you say, America, and what is the purpose of your visit? And you say, I'm here to see my master, Marababa. And then he says, could you do me the honor of coming to my house and having tea? And he points across this field at these apartments, and I see all these, there's just dead silence as everybody's staring at me. And I realize I gotta go. So I turn around and my clothes are gone. And so I said, okay, well, so we tramped across this field and into the apartment, and inside was one chair on one side and then no other furniture. They had me sit in the chair and everybody filed in and sat on the floor. And so they brought me a cup of tea and asked me a lot of questions and stuff. And then when it obviously had come to an end, I said, well, I think I should go now. And then this other man stands up, said, sir, you've done this man the honor of coming to his apartment, and I live right next door. So over to that apartment we went. And after I'd finished the tea that time, the crowd opened up and this woman stepped out and she had all my clothes, all washed, dried, and folded. So Adi had done me an incredible favor by putting me in that hotel, because it was, wherever I went, there was always like a crowd of 300 or 400 people, and they were so sweet, it didn't bother me. What I didn't mention, that there was only 3 other people there at the time. There was one man from Boston, a young guy from Boston, and a couple. One was from Australia, and the other was from England. And me and the guy from the couple just hit it off, and we were just really liked each other. So we would spend some time together, going down into the bazaar and stuff and walking around. And in fact, I had told Maureen, there you are. We had talked about a story I had shared with you. When we walked through the bazaar, there was this woman sitting on the ground with some bananas. So I asked her how much a banana was, and she said 4 anna. And 4 anna is like a quarter of a rupee. And I said, well, how much is the whole bunch? And she told me the price, but it was double the price. And I said, well, why is it double? And she said, well, if I sell you all my bananas, I'll have nothing to sell. So I said, so it made sense to me, so we bought the bananas. Then we were going through these alleyways with these spice dolls, and they had these boxes of spices that were color I've never seen before. It's so intense and so bright. And we were just getting involved in this conversation, and we saw a little chai shop, so we decided to go in and have tea. And we had tea, and once we were done, we noticed that the man picked up the cups and wiped them out with this rag and took them to the next table. And then we looked around and we realized this was a leper's cheap. So all the people had leprosy. So,
A leper's tea shop.
so anyway, and then we found the young man from Boston, and he was laying in the dirt flat on his back, smiling from ear to ear. And I think what it was is he just couldn't take that 400 or 500 people following you around. It just overwhelmed him. And so we had to take him to Adi's office, and then somehow Adi put him and got hold of his parents in Boston and put him in a taxi, and they sent him away. But then I realized I had to change money. And so I found a bank, and I had changed money once before in Bombay, and it was a kind of a strange experience because I went into this room, and there was about 8 men sitting around at desks on the floor, where the desk is just over their lap. And I handed this traveler's check to the man, and he held it up and he looked at it, and then he handed it to the man next to him, who looked at it, and who handed the next man next to him, and it went all the way around the room, and then came all the way back. And then the man stamped it, and the money came out of somewhere, but they just have, that's the way India was. They found this way to create 10 jobs out of one. And we just do it differently. We put people on welfare. But anyway, I had to change money again, so I went into this bank and told them I needed to change money, so they took me back to the manager's desk, and he called for a chair, and they put it up, and I sat next to him, and then he ordered tea, and they brought us tea, and then he sent this guy off to get a book, and then 2 guys come back with this book, one on each end. This is a giant book, and a rump, they put it on the desk, and rump, they open it up, and he makes a notation in the book, I guess, about our transaction, and then closes it up and off. But that's, that's the way it was. I mean, they could turn this one little transaction into a job for 5 people. After that, I went back to the trust office, and Adi said, "You need to change money?" And I said, "Oh, I just did that." And, oh, that's not, because back then you made a little money when you changed money, and I think Adi was anticipating changing money for me. And I said, I just done. So now I'm doubly in trouble with Adi. So he says, "Do you want to stay at Mehrabad?" And I said, "Sure." "All right, how about a donation?" And I was on the spot, I didn't know what to say, And I said, "Well, okay, I'll just pay you my regular hotel rate." And he said, "Okay." And so they sent me off to Mehrabad to stay. And I stayed in a little room that was right off Mandalay Hall, or a little cabin that was right off Mandalay Hall. And when I arrived, Padre said to me, "The tomb." He didn't want to talk or anything. He just said, "Go to the tomb." And so I went up to the tomb, and Nanakare was there. And of course, Nanakar gives you a big embrace and says, "Welcome home." And then he gestures for me to go in the tomb, and he said, not to step on the threshold. And as I step in, there's this guy sitting in the corner there. And he's someone that I know, but I don't know. But for no reason at all, I don't like him. And here he is, sitting in the tomb when I first arrived. And I think to myself, come on, Baba, why? You know, I've traveled all this way, and here he is, sitting in the tomb. And so anyway, I sat down on the other side, and then he unfolded his legs, and his feet stuck out. And Nanakar came in that door, and just, it was, you know, get out of here. You know, I mean, it was just, he was very upset because you never put your feet towards the master. And, but my feelings about this poor guy changed immediately. I just felt so bad for him because I knew he hadn't done it on purpose. It was just a mistake, you know, he didn't know any better. But I never saw him again. That was the last time I saw him. So anyway, I settled in, living down in Lower Mehrabad, and every day I would go up and spend time with Mansari in her kitchen, and we'd talk and talk and talk, and then I'd spend a lot of time with Padre and down in his little workroom and stuff. And Padre was he was so great. He was just wonderful to spend every day with. He was just gentle. And he would tell me all kinds of little things. Like once he asked me, he says, "Do you know what obedience is?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Let me tell you." He gave me an example. He said one day Baba called him and said, "Padre, I want you to go to Ahmednagar, get some flowers, and be back in 20 minutes. And Padre just ran for his bike. And as he was like running and hopping on the bike, someone said, "Stop, Baba wants you." And Padre went back and Baba said, "By the way, Padre, can you do that in 20 minutes? Padre said, "No, absolutely not." And so Baba said, "Well, take whatever amount of time it takes, but, you know, go get some flowers." And Padre explained that whenever Baba gave you an order, you couldn't, you just had to follow it, you know. He says you couldn't question it or anything, you just had to start to execute it. And then he said, but Baba never puts you in a position where you can't fulfill it. So I had a lot of little incidents with Padre where he's just teaching me little things. And at the same time, Sidhu and Muhammad are staying in Mandali Hall in Lower Mehrabad. Sidhu was sleeping on one side and Muhammad was sleeping on the other side. And one day I encountered him outside, and Muhammad started talking a lot. And as I approached him, I said, "Hello, Sidhu, what's Muhammad saying?" And he said, "No, nothing, nothing." And I said, no, what's he saying?" He said, "It's nothing, it's just gibberish." I said, "Come on, Sidhu, tell me what he's saying." And finally he said, "Okay, Muhammad is saying that he would like to go out with you. And you could go drinking and meeting girls, and you'd have a lot of fun." And so I said, "I understand. Muhammad's dealing with me on the mental plane. This is how he sees me on the mental plane." And so Muhammad and I had it was fun with Muhammad. One day I came in and one day I came in and he was sitting on his bed and he saw me and he smiled and he waved me to come over and he patted the bed next to him. He said, "Sit here." And I sit next to him and he shows me this magazine, and it's a girly magazine. So he looks, he shows it to me, and he nods, like it? And he shows me another one, like it? Another day I came and I brought him some Cadbury chocolate, and that was it. He said, Cedar said he gave me 10,000 blessings. Another time we were on the back porch, and I was thinking, boy, it would be nice to teach Muhammad English so we could talk. And the minute I thought that, he said, Billy, Billy. And there was a cat running by, and that's what, in his language, that's what you call a cat. And he just started pointing to things and giving me, he was teaching me his language. So it was every day was like that. It was like spending hours with Padre and hours with Mansari and hours with Sidhu and Muhammad. Like one day I went up and I knew how to obedience train dogs. And so Mansari had 4 or 5 dogs or something. And so I obedience trained them, and she couldn't believe it, that these dogs could actually, I tell them, and they'd do it. And so she told me, okay, command them to do this, just stay, and then she started digging all these ticks out of their ears and stuff. But, so it was just like, one day, has anybody heard the story of Mansari and the cobra? Yeah. She tells me this story where she's asleep and she wakes up and this cobra sleeps on her chest, and the cobra's face is right here. And I guess the way they, these guys that have the basket, and the reason they use the horn is because the cobra likes the breath of the horn. And the cobra was just sitting there breathing her breath. And she knocks it off, gets a stick, and beats it to death. And Mansari's what, like 4'6", maybe? Yeah. So that brings me to another story. And one day I'm coming up the hill, and these 2 guys are coming down the hill, but they're like frantically coming down the hill. They're rushing down the hill. And they don't even say, they just go right by me. They don't say anything to me. And so I continue up the hill, and I see Mansari. There's this bench outside the tomb, and there's this guy sitting on the bench, and Mansari standing over him. And she just giving him, I don't know what. She calls me over, and she says, you see this man? You see this man here? He's destroyed himself for the rest of his life. Apparently these 3 guys had come up and tried to tell Mansari she's going to have to leave the hill. These were the original trust people. And so anyway, I'm going to let Clive wanted to say something at this point, I think.
What month was this?
This had to be like early November.
So November of '69 is.
Now, exactly a year later, I arrived in India. And when I heard Greg tell this story about Mansari standing over this man with I don't know if she had a stick.
No, she was just shaking her finger at him.
Well,
But he was like going down into the
she
ground.
said a lot more than you're even telling, right? I mean, she was really reading him the riot act.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently, these 3 individuals had gone up there. It turns out the man that she was telling him he was finished, he was, he had, what was her words? She
said
sort of condemned him to the outer regions.
Even more harshly than I'm putting it. He had not only destroyed himself, I'm saying he destroyed himself for life, but she kind of made it even more than that. But
anyway, it turns out that man was Kutum Shastri, who was the chairman of the Albatross, the very first chairman appointed by Baba in 1959. So he had gone up there with these two other guys to throw Mansari off the hill. Now, when Greg told this story, I was like shocked because it immediately reminded me of something unbelievable, a story that I have thought about over the years, but it has never been shared publicly that I know of. And so this is one of the reasons I think Greg and I got together. It was we started to see that there were parallels between our experiences. So 1 year later, in about December of 1970, when I arrived, I was staying at Vilu Villa with Soros and Vilu. And this was, I had been there at Darshan, but Darshan was a different experience. First of all, it was in Pune, it was at, you're with hundreds of other people, you're not really interacting with the Mandali at all, this was a whole different ballgame, because I was living at Vilu Villa with Soros and Vilu, and I don't quite remember exactly when it started, but I started to notice that these big gatherings of the Mandali were happening at Vilu Villa while I was there. And suddenly, all these cars would pull up into Vilu Villa with people, with Erich, Mani, Rano, Meherji, Adi, lawyers, and just all sorts. Nariman, Arnavas's husband.
Baldwin too, probably.
Well, all these people would show up, and at first I had no idea what was going on. It turned out, but they would Vilu would know in advance because somebody would call that they were coming. So she would have a whole meal prepared. Didn't matter what time of day it was. It could be 3 in the afternoon or 6 in the afternoon. It turned out that the Mandali were being dragged into court because they were in a lawsuit. Kudum Shastri had filed a lawsuit against the Mandali. And is anyone here aware of this story at all?
Barely. Just, can you expound what the lawsuit was about?
Well, it was this was this is quite. I mean, I've written this up but haven't published it because it's about a 20-page story. So I'm only able to cover the highlights here right now. But when Greg told his part of the story, all of it fell into place because that was the missing. In other words, that was so graphic, that story of Mansari standing over Kudum Shastri and basically reading him the Riot Act, which I can only imagine what that was like to witness. But so I was witnessing the next part of this the next chapter of this story, which was when they're in a lawsuit. So all the Mandali are being dragged into court every day, or every other day. I can't remember how frequent it was, but so I was one of 2 or 3 people from the West who were able to sit there at that dinner table with all the Mandali, hearing the day's events in court. And Mani would imitate the judge, the lawyers, and everybody else. So Mani was the only one at the table who saw the fun of this. To everyone else, this was hell. I mean, because in a way it was humiliating for the Mandali. Meaning Baba had just dropped the body, and they're in deep water. They were having to be dragged. In other words, from the moment Baba dropped his body, the Mandali were having to swim, maybe not knowing how to swim in the world. And so it's kind of like, you saw this with Mara also, although Mara was not at these meetings. She wasn't part of that. She would always be protected from that. But so the reason I'm telling you this story is you can kind of get the picture, because it leads to the next part that Greg knows about too, and that is that Erich Jeswala took notice of the fact that I was witnessing all this. So one day at Marazad, he pulls me aside. This is the first time that I'd ever been pulled aside by Erich for a private talk. which happened a handful of times over my lifetime, over the years. And it was always about something very serious to him. In other words, he would never do it just to shoot the bull. It had a purpose. So he pulls me aside and he says, you know, what all this lawsuit and all these lawyers and all this chaos is my fault. So I call this Erich's confession when I wrote the story up, because it was almost like he was confessing to me. And it showed me how human he was and how vulnerable. He says, this was all my fault. He said in 1959, when Mayor Baba had a men's meeting it was a men's meeting of workers. You know, it was in 1959, and Baba was working on establishing the trust. In other words, a charter for the trust in India. And Erich said, you know, there had been a whole day of events and, you know, discussions, and Baba, you know, was talking about his legacy and his trust and the future, and they broke for lunch. What Erich told me is that at a certain point they broke for lunch, so all the men that were there, these were group leaders from different parts of India. And so when they broke for lunch, Erich had the privilege of being able to just sit separately from all of the other people with Baba and have lunch. But they would respect Baba's privacy. And Erich said that suddenly Baba said to him, he said, Erich, I want you to be the first chairman of the Avatar Mayor Baba Trust. And Baba was very serious about it. And Erich immediately said, no, Baba, no, I don't want to, I can't do that. He made all kinds of excuses why he couldn't do it and wouldn't do it. And Baba, and then he immediately, somebody walked right in front of his visual, Baba, and they're both their visual screen, you know, not too far away. It was Kudum Shastri. And Erich just said, what about him? He would be great. That guy is, he's a business guy. He knows how, you know. And so Baba looked at Erich with a scowl on his face, and then he went like this. This will come around your neck. So I don't know if anyone's heard that story before, because I don't know if it's in print, but
Yeah, that story's been told.
has it? Yeah, I had not. So I heard that in 1970, and that's...
Erich had actually told me the identical story. It was much shorter, but he just said that one day, when I forgot the scene, he didn't really set the scene to me, but he said he was with Baba, and Baba asked him to chair the trust, and Erich just said, oh no, Baba, not me, no, please. And then he pointed to a man walking by, and I think same thing, Baba just said, this will be a real problem later on. I don't remember it as vividly as Clive does, but it's almost identical.
One of the reasons why it's so vivid for me is because when Greg was there, the whole thing hadn't blown up into a big deal. By the time I got there, it was a full-blown, and by the way the Baba resolved this, which I did not know because I left
India in April of '71. Kudum Shastri was still alive. So this was all still going on with the lawsuit and the case, and I remember thinking, this is part of Baba's humiliation, that they're sharing in Baba's humiliation. And suddenly I hear a few months later, Kudum Shastri died of a heart attack. So the whole case was dropped from that point, and then I believe Mani was immediately appointed chairman. Is that right?
Yeah.
Clive, what was the lawsuit about?
There's much more.
There's much more to say about all this because but we don't have time to talk about it all. There was a split in India that started because of this situation. So sometime if we want to go into a lot more detail, but I don't want to break the momentum of Greg's story.
Anyway, I told that part to just, one is to kind of introduce the problem of the trust, but the other was just how powerful Mandali was. For this just little tiny woman, she was just, she could blow me over with any problem, without any problem at all. I remember once, just to digress a little bit, I was there in India later on, and she grabbed me and she said, "Come with me." And we walked through the weeds, these real high weeds, behind the tomb, and I caught up with her, and she was standing over this little area that was cleared out, and then there was this marijuana plant growing. And she said, "Is that what I think it is?" And I said, "Yeah." "Okay, go." And I never heard any more about it, but I can't imagine what happened to whoever planted that, because she knew who it was. So she was frightening. Yeah, that reminds me, a couple of things. One is that the night watchman there at the time was this amazing person. His skin was just dark as you could be, and his eyes were really, really bright. And he would sleep at night with his head against the door with a hatchet under his head. There was no one going to bother that tomb, right?
Was that Jungly Master?
Huh?
Jungly Master.
What's that?
Was that Jungly Master?
No, I don't think so. And he was a very mysterious character. He would just kind of like be there and then just disappear, in the morning. She was telling me that one morning she had this feeling of kind of anxious about something about the tomb. And so she rushed over to the tomb, but she forgot the keys. So when she got to the tomb, you could push the door open a little bit, ajar, and see inside. And she pushed it open, and she said she thought she saw, she said she saw Baba's sadra flash by the door. And she said, Baba, is that you?" And so she had to rush back and get the keys, and she came back and opened the door, and the tomb was a big hole, and she said there was this smell of roses, this intense smell of roses, and she said that smell just covered the whole hill, and that I think thousands of people came there to visit the tomb because of that. Now, when I talked to Padre about it, Padre and Mandali was so different, Like when Baba dropped the body, the first thing Padre did is he went up and demanded all the keys and everything from Mandali. And I said, "Well, why?" And she's a woman, She hears Baba's dropped the body, she's going to come apart and everything will be just messed up. And then I asked Padre about the scene with the tomb, and he just got a wheelbarrow and shovel and went up and filled the hole and smoothed it out. That was it. Padre was just, he was funny because he wasn't into any kind of miracles or any things. In fact, it was funny because he, for a while, had been the photographer. And one day he had taken some pictures of Baba while Baba was standing, and Baba started to pray and then finished the prayers. And when Padre developed the pictures, the first picture is Baba standing there, and then the next picture is Baba's not there while he's praying, and the next picture he's back. And Padre just took those pictures to Erich or someone and said, I don't know what to do with this, take them. You know, it was just beyond his, you know, he just, it was, couldn't handle that. But anyway, yeah. So sometime this couple, the other couple, the Australian and the English person, I think the guy was from Australia and the woman was from England. Anyway, they told me one day they had been going out to Merazat every day, and I had been in Mehrabad. So one day they said they weren't going out to Merazat, and so I thought, well, I'll go to Merazat, you know. And so next morning I caught the bus and took it out and had the bus driver tell me where to get off. And this is my first visit at Merazat. And he let me off at the end of the road. And I just remembered that's this wonderful road. You know, it couldn't be more perfect walking down to God's house. And I'm thinking that I'm about, you know, to see these people that are like polished gems. And so I walk down the road, and then I see this, at the gate, looked like someone has come out, you know, to greet me. And then as I get closer, I see that it's Erich. And so this is perfect. I mean, this is the person I really want to see, and he's come out to greet me. And as I get closer, I notice that he's kind of got a unhappy look on his face. And when I get up to him, he says, "How could you? What is the matter with you?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Why? What are you doing here?" And I'm thinking, I don't know. What's the matter, Eric? And he said, "Didn't they tell you?" And I said, "Tell me what?" And I said, "You're not supposed to come today." And I said, "Oh, I didn't know that. They didn't tell me. I'm gone, you know." And he reached around and pulled me into the gate, and he said, "They didn't tell you?" And I said, "No." I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." And he said, he gave me a big hug, and he held me back and he looked at me and he said, "Baba told us we were going to meet his gems that he had polished." And it was that same thought that I had had. And he took me to his room, and we sat on his bed. And he had so few possessions, you know, it was just a bed and just a few things, and all he could come up with was some old passports of Baba's. So he showed me these passports and stuff, and then he said, "I think today would be a good day for you to go up on the hill." And I said, "Okay." And so he got me a hat and got me a scarf, got me a walking stick, and brought Baba's dog, Mustan, and sent us to the hill. So Mustan led the way, and I followed him. And as I was starting up the hill, I looked back, and I could see all the Mandali kind of had showed up and were all gathering together. And it looked like they were getting ready for lunch or something. I just assumed they were going to have lunch together. And so Mustan and I went up the hill, and it was just great. I mean, I was sitting on the edge of the hill with my legs hanging over, and Mustan was sitting next to me with his paws hanging over, and we're just looking at this vast plain of India. And we just sat there quietly, you know, together. And after a while, I got up and looked around on the hill, and I found this post that was kind of buried under the dirt. And I assumed it was like from the hut that they had built for Baba's seclusion. So I took a little sliver off of that. And then I found this other place on the other side where it looked like a seat kind of carved into the hill. And it was covered with quartz, you know, the glass-like quartz. And apparently someone told me that was Baba would sit there. That was his throne or something. Anyway, after a while, Mustan and I headed back down, and it probably been a couple of hours between going up and going down and the time we spent on top. And apparently, the reason that nobody was supposed to come that day was the Mandali were having a meeting. And they told me later, or Erika told me fairly soon after that, the reason they were meeting is they were deciding whether to disband and go home, back to their homes, or to stay and live as a family. And apparently my coming that day had something to do with that decision. They realized Baba's lovers are going to continue to come, and they had to be there. You know. So, let's see. So, you know, I spent the day with them and stuff, and I went out the next day, and the next day they took me into Mandali Hall, and they all sat around me and asked me a lot of questions. Questions about different people and stuff I knew. And they asked me about someone who I knew really well. His name is Jerry Paulson. Has anybody heard of Jerry Paulson? Right. Jerry was almost one of the last people to see Baba. He had gone to India against Baba's wishes, and he stayed in Calcutta, and he stayed in Calcutta for about a year with no money. And he would occasionally get $10 from his father. He called it a sawbuck or something. What he would do is he'd set up a credit account with a little food stand, and he'd run that credit till it ran out, and then he'd move to a new food stand and set up another credit account and do that, and again. And then when the money would come in, he would go pay them all off. So he managed to survive for a year on the streets of Calcutta, sleeping on the streets of Calcutta. He said at 10 o'clock in the morning, this big wagon would come around, and they'd pitchfork people into the wagon, because if you weren't awake by 10 o'clock in the morning, you were dead. And after about a year, he realized he couldn't do any more. You know, he was thin as a rail, and he wasn't going to survive. So he made an arrangement with some people to smuggle some drugs back to Europe, and you know, he felt that was his only way out. So he went down to the telegraph office to see if his father had sent him any more money. And there was a telegram from Adi saying, Baba says, come see me now. And so he got on the train and traveled across India and went and saw Baba. And Baba asked him, Baba said, ask me anything, and I'll give you an answer, you know. And Jerry said, do you know Mikanushi? And Baba said, perfect. Because that's who Jerry heard about Baba from. And Mika and Ursula had met Baba before as well. But then Baba said, how are you going to go home? And Jerry said, well, I'll go the way I came, overland. And Baba says, well, why don't you get on a boat and, you know, work and get yourself home by boat? And Jerry said, well, Baba, you can't do that because you have to get papers from the country that you live in, and the Siemens papers and stuff, so I can't do that. And Baba says, well, okay, but try. And so after Baba left, or after Jerry left Baba, he went down to Bombay, and he was wandering around by the docks, and he started talking to this guy, and this guy just happened to be the captain of one of these ships. And so the guy liked Jerry, and he said, I'll get you on board. And so the captain took Jerry, put him on the ship, and then he left to go do something, and the crew took Jerry and threw him off the ship. Because they thought he was an Indian stowaway, because he was so thin and so brown and everything. They just thought he was stowing away on the boat. But anyway, the captain came back and got him back on the boat, and they called him the Albatross, because he would sleep up above up by the bridge. Rather, he didn't want to sleep down inside with the bunks with everybody else. He wanted to sleep in this hammock up there. So they called him the Albatross. And Jerry's a very unusual character. Anyway, the boat was going to Seattle, Washington, and at the last minute there was a strike, so they had to divert to San Francisco. And when they got to San Francisco, Jerry got off the boat and he got hold of the Sufi Center, and they didn't want to have anything to do with Jerry. So they referred him to Rick Chapman. And I guess Rick didn't want anything to do with Jerry, so he gave him my number. And he called me, and Jerry stayed with me for quite a while. But it was great because he had all that fresh Baba energy with him. And so when I was in the room with the Mandali, the first thing is Erika says, "This is Jerry Paulson. What's going on with Jerry? Why did Baba see Jerry Paulson?" And I tried to explain in the end I said, he's just a special person. And only Baba would know that, he's just a wonderful character. For a while I had a leather shop on the north side of campus, and it was in the back of a shoe shop, and the guy that had the shoe shop was this big burly guy. His name was Tony Barbaria, and he was an ex-Hell's Angel. And so the Hell's Angels would come there all the time, but they would have to go back and sit in my shop. So I've got these Hell's Angels sitting all around my shop with all these Baba posters all over. And Jerry would come there all the time, and they just fell in love with Jerry. Because I remember he came in with his new girlfriend once, and they described it as looked like he was pulling a wagon behind him. But one day Jerry came in and he was out of sorts, and one of these guys said, "Hey Jerry, you want to go with me? I'm going somewhere." And Jerry said, "Oh, okay." And so he and Jerry left, and they got in his truck and went off. And when they came back, this guy said, "What's the matter with Jerry?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When we got in the truck, he didn't sit next to me." Because Jerry would always, like you were riding in a car, he would come and slide over and sit right next to you and put his arm around you. When he first met Mick and Ursula, he went home with them, and he laid his sleeping bag out in the middle between the two of them. That's just how Jerry was. So anyway, I tried to explain Jerry to the Mandali, but I don't think they quite got it. Anyway, after that was over, Erich said to Bal the two, "Bal, why don't you take Greg over and show him Baba's room?" Bal said, "Okay." So we went over to Baba's room, and Bal showed me Baba's bed and had me put my hand on it and hold my hand there. And then he showed me something in the back of the room. It was like a piece of plastic with Baba's hair in it. And then he went over and showed me Baba's window, and he said, Baba said this is his TV. He could watch his lovers, and they were coming by the thousands. And then at some point he said, "Why don't you just stay here and be with Baba?" And I said, "Okay." And he left. And about 5 minutes later, there was a door in the back of the room, and this door started to open. And it was from the women's side. And I thought, "Oh God, here I am. I'm like a burglar caught." So I start to make it for the door, and someone says, "Stop." And I turn around, and it's Meru. And she says, "Come." And I come to the back door, and she says, "Follow me and don't touch anything." And so I said, "Don't worry." I put my hands in my pocket. And I followed her into the women's side, and kind of a living room kind of area, and then around the corner to the left, and here's Mara standing in front of me. And she has her arm in a sling. And the first thing she says is, "This is a gift from Baba. He's sharing his suffering with me." And then she started to tell me that she's been so sad since Baba dropped the body, that she's, one day she's just praying to Baba that he'll give her a sign that he's there with her. And while she's doing this, she looks up and she sees Baba's face in the tree, in the trunk of the tree. So she yells to the other women to get a camera quick before it disappears. And they go and get a camera and they take a picture, and she goes to her nightstand and she opens it up and pulls out this picture. It's a little tiny picture, and she hands it to me and she says, "Keep it." And then she goes back to the nightstand and she reaches in again and she pulls out this little package of Baba's hair and hands it to me and says, "Keep it." And then she goes back again and she comes out with this little piece of mango skin that Baba had sucked on. And she hands it to me and says, "Keep it." And then she goes back again and brings out this rose that she took off of Baba's body when they put him in the tomb. And she hands it to me and says, "Keep it." And I have it with me, and I intended to bring it, and I think I left it back at the center. And I apologize, but I've only opened the package maybe 3 or 4 times in the last 50 years. But if we get a chance, I'll share it with you, or if I see you on the center, ask me and I'll share it with you. But I kind of can't remember what happened after that, but at some point they must have let me out, because it was my impression that the women didn't see, or the men didn't see women, and there was no interaction. So to me, it was like being in the women's side was like I was out of body experience. And later on, I think it was Erich explained to me that the Mandali had cooked that whole thing up. They said that even all these months later, Mara was still constantly in grief, crying. And they thought that if they took a young Westerner over, that she'd start to talk about Baba and tell stories, and that would bring her out of it. And apparently it did to some extent, So she would start coming over to Mandali Hall and stuff.
Mara came to Mandali Hall?
Yeah. But again, she would sit in the back and she would stare at Baba's picture. Because I'd constantly turn around and look at her.
Well, one thing that is a takeaway from what Greg said is when we were at Darshan, Mara you could just see the dark circles under her eyes from crying. And there was only a few times, because I was in the 3rd Darshan group, so I don't know what it was like in the 1st and 2nd. We were in the last group, so Mara was still suffering tremendously. So Greg's talking about, 10 months later, she's still suffering, but beginning to come out of it. But at Darshan, Phyllis Frederick took me back with 2 of my old friends from LA, Jimmy Irons and Tim Owens. We were introduced privately to Mara and Monty, where Mara did the same thing at Darshan. She handed us a little package of Baba's hair and some prasad and things like that Baba had touched. And it was Phyllis arranged it because Mara couldn't do this for all the hundreds of people that were there. So it was very, very precious experience to go behind the curtain, you might say, and have this private moment with Mara. And so I want to mention something about my first impression at Darshan, which was in May of '69. I'm not going to talk about the Darshan much, but it plays into the overall theme. I was like Greg. I was new to Baba. Baba was in the body when I came to Baba, so when he dropped the body, I had to make a decision, about do I want to go or not go. And I instantly remember thinking, nothing has changed. He's dropped the body, but nothing's changed. The energy is exactly the same, if not. And I said I knew he would be there, and so I decided I'd get on a different plane. I had to drive across the country to New York City in order to get on a plane from LA. So it wasn't easy to do. It took about 2 weeks actually to get. But anyway, when I got to India, we were the first day of the darshan. I was walking up the steps of Guru Prasad, and I had in my head sort of an image of what spiritual people would look like and act like. And it was mainly from reading things like Autobiography of a Yogi and Ramakrishna's book. So I had all these impressions of Eastern people. But as I'm walking up the steps of Guru Prasad, I looked at these faces. And first, I had two immediate reactions. One was that they were all familiar. In fact, they were so familiar that I was in almost instant shock from it, because they looked more familiar than my own relatives. That was an immediate first impression. The second impression was when I got up and Mani greeted me, and some of the was that they were the most natural people I'd ever met. There was nothing, in other words, all my preconceived ideas of what spirituality were about was turned upside down in that first moment. The other thing I wanted to mention that relates to the story that Greg tells about, his experience of meeting Erika at the gate of Meherazad and what happened that day. Because this is related to what Adi Kairani told us after Darshan, when he came to America. This would have been after Greg had been to India. It was in 1970. And Adi told the story of how when Baba dropped the body, he was the only one that was sort of psychologically prepared to deal with it. Because Baba had been pushing him away for several years. And Adi told us all in California when we heard his story, he said, during this period of several years where Baba was pushing him away and distancing himself, Adi would cry constantly. He would just weep it was so painful. But when Baba dropped the body, he was the only one able to actually cope with the situation, because none of the rest of the Mandali were really expecting this. And as a matter of fact, they were taken by surprise. Like, for instance, Mara had thought that Baba was going to live another 20 years. So if you take 1969 to 1989, that's when Mara, it's 20 years, and it's when she passed. So, Mara was in total shock. And Mani told me a story privately one day in that 1971 trip, not at Darshan, because you didn't have any time with the Mandali at Darshan, hardly, very little. And Mani said that in November of 1968, Adi Jr. came with his wife and Amrit and Dara, and Baba presided over a wedding at Meherazad. It was the last actual gathering, I think, that Baba ever had with his close family and relatives. And Mani told me one day, she just said, when Audie Jr. came to India for that wedding, he pulled Monty aside and he said, "Can't you see what's happening?" You know, it was like, and Monty said, "What are you talking about?" And Audie said, "He's finished. He's done. He's out of here. He's done." And Monty was so upset by this. She told me this story personally. She was so upset that for the rest of the day she was in total depression. And then finally, at some point in the afternoon, Baba said, "What's wrong?" to her. And she didn't want to say. But Baba always knows, so she tells the story of what Audie had told her, and Baba he just looked away, like he didn't say anything. And so Audie Jr. also he was obviously able to see that Baba was finished. Anyway, we probably should wind up. Anything, Greg?
No. I continued to stay until the first Amatithi. And the first Amatithi was basically the women coming over from Merzad and some villagers coming up from Erlangen. And the villagers did this dance with these chains and stuff. And that was about it. It was very simple. And another week or so after that, I left. But I was thinking, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Or
How long were you there then? 4 months? Is that what you said?
it was from about the end of October till February.
Were there any Westerners besides yourself coming at that time?
Well, the other couple, there was a young guy that we sent back to Boston, and the other couple left about 2 or 3 weeks after I got there. So the majority of the time I was there, I was alone with the Mandali.
So you were one of the first, obviously.
What? I'm sorry.
You were one of the first, obviously, of the parade of Westerners
Yeah.
started.
Yeah, I think that my impression was that meeting with the Mandali was them coming out of mourning and realizing that they had work to do. And also the same thing with Mary was kind of that time coming out of mourning. The Mandali asked me if I wanted to stay and live there, and all I could think is that Baba wants me to go home and live where my karma is. You know, I would have liked to have stayed there, but I just didn't feel that Baba wanted me to stay there.
You weren't married at that time then?
I was at the end of a relationship, yeah. I didn't include my wife at the time. She disappeared right before we left, and she appeared at the last minute as I was going out the door, and she decided she wanted to come, but she didn't tell me her only intention of going was she always wanted to go to Europe. And the ticket that we had was this, called an IATA ticket, where you can go around the world and stop wherever you want, as long as you keep going in the same direction. So she had planned to just abandon me in Europe and go off on her own. And while we were there, she didn't go to Merzad or do any of those things. But what did happen was we were riding, we rented bicycles to ride out to Mehrabad. And there's that little bridge that you cross, is familiar with that? She fell under a bullock cart and almost got trampled to death. And then we had to go in and to extend our visa. So we had to take the bus to Pune. I'm not sure where else we went. But when we got in the bus, they had this little grab bar in front of you, and she knocked out her front teeth with that. And the dentist only had molars back, from the back to put in the front. And then when we came back in
You
Europe.
can see why he didn't start out with this story.
When we got to Europe, there was this really nice man from Swiss Air. He said, "I can see you've been on the road for a while." The whole trip cost about $300. We were staying in places that were like 50 cents a night. I had one pack this big, and that was my whole pack for over 3 months. I would wash my underwear every night. But he said, "I can see you've been on the road for a while." He said, "I'm going to do you a favor." He went and got us a hotel room for free. And that night, she fell in the shower and broke her ribs. So she was done. She had to return home.
When you came back home then, did you take up residence in San Francisco?
Did I what?
Did you live in San Francisco after that?
No, in Berkeley.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I lived in Berkeley.
Were you associated with the Sufis then when you came back?
No, it's interesting because one is, I found out later on that my ticket, the one that they canceled, Robbie Basho got that ticket. And it made me so happy. Everybody know Robbie Basho?
Yeah, I've heard the
Okay.
name.
He was this wonderful musician and just another one of those just characters, you know. The first time I saw Robbie was before we were Rattle Lovers. I went into this little place in Berkeley called the Jabberwock, and Robbie was on stage, and he was wearing this kind of Japanese kimono, and he had his hair in this big samurai knot, and he was playing a 12-string guitar, and I was just like, whoa, you know. But I was very happy that Robbie got the ticket, and he struggled a lot in the end. But for some reason, I had an aversion to the Murshida. And I think she had the same with me, because we were in an elevator once and we just stared at each other. All my friends were disappearing one at a time, and they were like being absorbed into Sufism, and pretty soon I felt like the last one, but it was just, there was never any attraction for me in Sufism. I did go to the center a lot to get pictures and books and stuff like that. And in fact, one day, I had kind of befriended this guy one of these guys that would preach at the campus stairs. You know.
Huey, the redheaded guy?
What's that?
Huey, the redheaded.
It wasn't Huey, but it was close to Huey, yeah. His name was Galen. And I took him with me to the Sufi Center. And it was really a comedy scene, because Hank Minlin was there, and he was typing something on the typewriter, and he threw his body over the typewriter, so so we couldn't see what he was typing. And then there was this commotion, and my wife's Aunt Ellie came out, and she was like kind of freaking out, and meanwhile Galen had like kind of wandered into Murshida's office and was sitting in Murshida's meditation chair. And so Sufis didn't have a lot of use for me. But one of the reasons that we came here tonight is that, at least I came here, is I felt very compelled to come and talk to you about the Mandali. Because I heard Alan Cohen's talk, and Alan and I have known each other for over 50 years. And I was uncomfortable with the way he described Erich, because I knew Erich very well. And Erich just, in my mind, would not behave the way Alan described him. Erich said to me once, he said, Baba taught us to never carry anything on our chest. He said, if you had something to tell someone, you told them, right? And that's what I loved about the Mandali. To me, they were like perfect human beings. And when I say perfect, I mean
Perfectly natural.
natural, but, you know, sometimes we want to say something and we don't say it, you know, because, you know, we're embarrassed or whatever. But the Mandali weren't that way at all. You know, they were very clear and very direct with you, and just, they were just totally balanced. You know, they were loving, but they were very direct. You know, if you did something wrong, they were going to tell you right away. And I didn't like it when Alan described Erich talking to Dr. Mackay, because it was like Erich was apologizing to Dr. Mackay. And that's, to me, a load of scat. You know, it's just not true, because I knew him very well. There's a lot of other things that I know, and it's too long to get into, and I don't want to get into, but the reason that we got on the plane and flew this far was to tell you there's a different story. You know, and
Excuse me, do you know Ed Van Buskirk out there then?
what's that?
Do you know Ed Van Buskirk?
Very well.
Yeah, okay.
Been friends with Ed for a long time.
Ed was my contact with.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Before.
Ed wrote a great letter. Did you read the letter?
I didn't read his letter, but I saw his stuff on podcasts and,
Yeah, if you go to
YouTube.
Mere Legacy, he wrote a wonderful letter to Khaled, and it was real clear and direct. No, Ed's been a friend for 50 years.
okay.
Ursula's my oldest friend.
Are you still in contact with Mick?
With who?
Mick?
Nope.
Mick Hamilton?
Mick and I have a really bad history,
Oh.
you know, but that's okay.
But you're still friends with Ursula.
Oh, yeah, we were lifelong friends. Mick was the one that told me I wasn't a Bible lover anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, Mick and Ed lived together. They were, I came to Baba at one of their Baba meetings in Davenport.
They went to chiropractic college together.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
too,
yeah. And they opened an office as chiropractors together in Berkeley back in the old days. Yeah.
We have a couple of hundred slides that we're going to show at some point of those between 1969 and 1971, and they're a lot of them are original. I mean, they've basically been in trays for 50 years, so these have not been seen. Lots of incredible pictures of the Mandali and at that period of time, which was a very special period of a couple of years where very few pilgrims, and you had incredible quality time with the Mandali.
There's also, Joan and I have been married for 30 years, and Joan was a Sufi. She was born into it.
Yeah.
And for the 30 years that we've been together, we really have had a very difficult time talking about any of these subjects, because I said I had my feelings in terms of the Murshida and stuff, and she really didn't, that really upset her. And so only recently have we really started to talk, or has she been willing to talk. And I don't know if it was Alan's video or talk that she's been kind of opening up more and more, but somehow that shook her loose, and she's now started to write a lot of things that that have happened. Sufism actually really tore her family up. I mean, her dad, in the beginning, I think I said there was like 13 Sufis. Oh, okay. When her dad joined with Don Stevens, there was like 13 Sufis, and they were all women, older women. And it wasn't until later on when Baba brought all of these people in. But her dad paid the rent for years out of his own pocket. And then when Dr. Mackay came along, Ludd had been one of the preceptors. They removed him as a preceptor. In fact, he and someone else were probably going to be some kind of combination of the new merchant. But Dr. Mackay removed him as a merchant and then started making fun of him, mocking him.
Removed him as a preceptor.
As a preceptor in the meetings. And then he got sick, got leukemia, and started getting more ill, and so they kept him in the basement of the Sufi Center, and they set up times for people to go see him, and nobody visited him.
Who are you talking about?
Ludd,
Ludd?
yeah.
Who had been there from the very beginning
Yeah.
and had actually helped pay the bills for years.
And 3B said he deserved better than that. And Joan went to see him right in the last, when he was right about to die. And as she entered, what's his name? Ira Dietrich was in the hallway, and he threw up his hands like that and said, "Stop." And Jim Mackay was there as well, and they told her she couldn't come in. And here her father is dying, you know, and they don't even allow her to come in. If you want, I'll show you one more story she wrote up.
Yeah.
Her sister 3B, who was very caught up with Dr. Mackay. She died, what, 2011? 2000, yeah.
Approximately.
Yeah. They were, when they first got Yukon Dunes, the merchant said everybody has to come out to Yukon Dunes. And she told Joan she was afraid to go. She says, because people that go to Yukon Dunes come back and they get cancer. And so anyway, they went to Yukon Dunes, and Carol Connor said, had the whole group there and says, "Is everybody happy?" And 3B said, "No, I'm not happy." And so Carol Connor said, ordered her to come in and have a private meeting. And she told 3B, she says, "Soon you're going to know what it feels like to die." And they came back, and 3B went with Claudia for a road trip up into Northern California, and her back got very sore. And they came back, and she went to the doctor, and she had cancer. And she had, her oncologist was a Sufi, and he just delayed and delayed treatment until it was too late. And I was really upset, you know, because I thought, you know, get rid of him and get someone that will take care of her. But in the end, Joan went in to see her in her last days, and she took a picture of Baba and a picture of Carol Connor, and she set them on the stand, and she brought her some of the thing. And then the doctor came in, the Sufi oncologist, and saw the pictures, and he looked very angrily at Joan and took Baba's picture and flipped it around and just left Carol Connor's picture there. Yeah. So Joan is starting to write some of this up, and she's just opening up more and more, you know, because it's always been a struggle for her, and a struggle between us as a couple, because I didn't have a good feeling about it, you know, I guess that's all I should say. Jay Bottoms.
Jay Bottoms.